In the heart of ancient Troy, where honor was bound to family and loyalty, one man stood above them all. Hector, Prince of Troy. While the Greeks sought glory and riches, Hector's soul was tethered to his people, his city, and the walls that held their history. Known as the Defender of Troy, he was a warrior not for conquest, but for protection, fighting to shield the lives of those he cherished. Hector was the eldest son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba. From the moment he first lifted a sword, he knew he was more than just a soldier. He was the very heart of his city, the embodiment of Troy's spirit. Unlike Achilles, whose thirst for vengeance and eternal glory drove him to fight, Hector's purpose was rooted in loyalty to his family, his people, and the city that had raised him. Known far and wide as the Defender of Troy, he inspired awe among his soldiers, love among his people, and respect, even fear, among his enemies. From a young age, Hector understood that the fate of Troy rested on his shoulders. As the firstborn son, the weight of leadership, honor, and responsibility was his to carry. The gods themselves watched him closely, but Hector knew that divine favor could only do so much. It was his duty alone to protect Troy's walls, his courage alone that could prevent the city's fall. Yet Hector was not only a prince or a warrior, he was a father, a husband, and a son. Each time he left Troy's walls, he left behind Andromache, his beloved wife, and their young son, Astyanax. He understood the risk. Each battle could be his last. Each goodbye might be forever. And still, he never hesitated. For every man who looked to him, for every family that placed their faith in him, he lifted his spear and marched forward, time and again, a steady figure against the chaos of war. As a warrior, he fought with valor, but as a man, he fought with a heart bound to the people he served. Every time he faced the Greeks, he did so not as a prince, but as a son of Troy, willing to lay down everything he held dear for the city he called home. As the years dragged on, Hector encountered warriors as skilled and determined as he was. Among the first to challenge him was Protesilaus, the Greek prince who, driven by a lust for glory, leaped ashore knowing he might be the first to die. And indeed, he was. Hector faced him and struck him down, yet he saw in Protesilaus a mirror of his own devotion, a man willing to lay down his life for a cause. The victory was hollow, a reminder that courage alone was no armor against the grim toll of war. Then came Ajax, towering and indomitable, a champion as steadfast as Hector himself. In their many duels they clashed like thunder and lightning, each strike a test of strength and will. Their duels were fierce, unyielding, but never hateful. Hector saw in Ajax a kindred spirit, another man bound by duty, another warrior who carried his people's fate on his shoulders. Their respect for each other grew with each encounter, and though neither could claim true victory, they fought for something larger than themselves. Ajax fought for Greece, Hector for Troy. Together they fought with a brutal honesty that both admired and feared. But not every adversary fought with honor. Hector's path crossed with Odysseus, the cunning tactician whose mind was as sharp as any blade. Though their encounters were brief, each tested Hector's endurance and wit. Odysseus, known for his guile, probed Hector's defenses, testing for any weakness, looking for any vulnerability. But Hector's resolve remained unbroken. His strength lay not just in muscle, but in his unyielding spirit. While Odysseus's tactics were often elusive, Hector learned to anticipate his moves, countering each with a determination that could not be swayed. Yet Hector's true test came not from these warriors, but from the mighty Achilles. For years, Hector had heard tales of Achilles' unmatched prowess, of his wrath and ferocity on the battlefield, and of the prophecy that whispered Achilles was destined to live a short but eternally remembered life. Achilles was no mere soldier. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of rage and vengeance. When Achilles returned to the battlefield, his heart consumed with grief over the death of Patroclus, it was as if an unstoppable storm had been unleashed. Hector knew that he alone stood between Achilles and the gates of Troy. He knew that the Greeks looked upon Achilles as their last hope for victory, and he understood that the fate of his city rested on his shoulders in this final brutal test. Hector's heart ached for those he would leave behind, but his sense of duty was unwavering. He knew that Troy's fate lay in his hands, and that he alone could delay the inevitable tide crashing upon the walls of his home. The battle between Hector and Achilles was the climax of the Trojan War, a clash of two titans, both fueled by purpose and driven by forces far greater than themselves. Hector fought not only for Troy, but for his family, and for a future where his son, Astyanax, could grow up in peace. Achilles, in contrast, fought with a fury born of grief and a need for vengeance, the death of his dear friend Patroclus igniting a wrath that could not be contained. Their duel was a storm of strength, precision, and skill, and the walls of Troy trembled as the two titans collided. For a moment it seemed Hector might hold his ground, but against Achilles' wrath, even Hector's strength could not prevail. As he fell, a heavy silence washed over the battlefield, and with his dying breath, he thought of his family, his city, and the legacy he would leave behind. He pleaded with Achilles, asking that his body be returned to Troy, so that he might receive the rites of an honorable burial. Yet Achilles, consumed by vengeance, was deaf to his plea. He tied Hector's lifeless body to his chariot and dragged it around the walls of Troy, an act meant to humiliate, to remind the Trojans of their champion's fall. But Achilles' attempt at humiliation only served to immortalize Hector. Hector's fall left a void in Troy, a wound that ran deeper than the loss of a warrior. With their beloved prince gone, the Trojans looked to another leader to carry on his legacy. It was his younger brother, Paris, who took up the mantle, though his motivations and methods were far different from Hector's. Paris, known more for his beauty and his romance with Helen than for his prowess on the battlefield, was not the soldier Hector had been. Still, he stood as Troy's hope, leading his people in what would become the final acts of the Trojan War. Achilles, the great warrior who had brought terror to Troy, was himself vulnerable. His own fate was sealed by the very gods who had granted him his strength. While he seemed untouchable, legend held that he bore one weakness, the heel that had not been dipped in the river Styx. Guided by Apollo, Paris fired an arrow that struck Achilles in his only vulnerable spot, his heel. In that moment, the invincible warrior was felled, brought down not by a mighty hero but by a single arrow, his mortal flaw exposed. As Achilles fell, the Greeks and Trojans alike saw the mighty conqueror lie defeated, his legend sealed in both his strength and his vulnerability. His death marked the beginning of the end for the Greek forces, as the war grew ever more brutal, the gods themselves weighing in on the outcome. Hector's death became a rallying cry for Troy, and Achilles' fall signaled a turning point for the Greeks, a reminder of the cost of glory and the frailty of even the mightiest among them. As Troy faced its darkest days, Hector's memory continued to be in the hearts of those who would forever remember him as the true heart of Troy, the prince who gave everything for his people and became a hero for all time.